Today I'm going to quickly show you 9 different watercolor techniques that we can do within our classroom. The first one is Crayon Resist, so I'm going to draw with a white crayon. And the second one is Oil Pastel Resist. So remember we talked before about how resist means kind of to say no. So when we paint on top of our crayon or our oil pastel, it's going to say, heck no paint, you can't sit on top of me, and kind of push it away. I am using our watercolor and our brushes that we have in our classroom. And my paint was already wet, but just remember that when you open up a palette that hasn't been used, you want to wake that paint up by adding some water on top before you get started. The next technique that I'm going to show you is a masking tape resist. So you can take masking tape and you can cut it or rip it into any shapes or lines that you'd like, lay it down and paint on top of it. Once that paint is dry, you can peel your masking tape up and it will reveal the white of the paper underneath your paint layers. Next technique is wet on dry. So we're using a wet paintbrush on dry paper. It's pretty self-explanatory. Our next one will be wet on wet. So I'm going to take a clean brush, I'm going to clean it off, put a little clean puddle of water on my paper, then tap my paint and tap my puddle, and it gives it a really nice watercolor effect for our wet on wet technique. Following wet on wet, I'm going to do a dry brush. So I'm going to grab a dry brush, I'm going to get some paint on there, and you'll see the difference on your paper when you use a nice wet brush versus when you use a dry brush in the texture qualities that your paint shows on your paper. In the middle of filming, my camera decided to stop working, so I'm sorry. We have a little split screen action happening here, but this next technique is just a wash. So we're doing a flat wash of color, meaning that we want that color to look nice and even. So that is your flat wash. Then we have a gradient wash, and when doing a gradient wash, it's going to sort of illustrate different values. And we talked before about creating value using water, but if you don't remember, the more color or the more pigment, the more times you touch your paint, then the more colorful it's going to be or saturated. And the more water I have on my brush, then the lighter that color is going to show up. So you can take your time and add some water up at the top, add some more color down the bottom to give it a nice gradient to look like it's going from light to dark. The last technique that we're going to look at is a salt technique. So I'm going to do wet on dry for this. You can do it with wet on wet, you can do it with wet on dry, it is up to you. And then you'll just get a little bit of salt in your hand, and different salts can create different textures. I'm just using regular table salt, and I'm going to sprinkle it right on top of that puddle of paint that I just created. Once all of this dries and the salt kind of gets eroded away, it's going to leave a really beautiful texture in your painting. I know this is a really quick run through of these 9 techniques, but if you have any questions, I am here to help you, and I hope that you have fun creating these different watercolor techniques.